10 ways to make Verzuz bigger and better. Now, I enjoy watching the Verzuz battles for the most part. In fact, I think it's one of the most ingenious products ever produced in the history of music. No exaggeration. Shout out to Swiss Beats and Timbaland. I think it's fair to say that Verzuz has been the biggest ongoing showcase of black music since the peak period of the Apollo Theater. With that said, I have some thoughts on how to make Verzuz bigger and better. Number one, reduce the matchups to 10 songs for each artist. So let's just keep it real. The vast majority of artists don't actually have 10 certified hits. In fact, even some of the artists we consider big time don't have the catalog to actually justify a 20 set song performance. Most major artists can give you a handful of hits, plus another handful of records from their catalog that even casual fans will remember and enjoy. But only true blue fans will know word for word of 20 plus songs by any given artist. And with Verzuz trying to grow its audience and keep them engaged, they know they have to go well beyond true blue fans in the reach of its product. Matchups with my best 10 versus your best 10 would be a much better product. With that said, matchups between major artists, I'm talking about the superstars, the living legends, should absolutely be 20 versus 20, maybe even 25 versus 25. The bottom line is, artists in this top tier have the catalogs to justify entertaining a live audience in the crowd and at home all night long. Just as long as the quality of the production is high and Verzuz keeps the show moving. Number two, put on more undercard matchups before the main event. Now, the last Verzuz that took place, Omarion versus Mario, it was interesting, I just say that. Omarion's, he got some decent solo records, though his biggest joints are with B2K. Mario is definitely the stronger solo artist between the two in my opinion, but they're both talented artists respectively. What I found even more interesting in more ways than one was the pre-show that featured Ray J, Sammy, Bobby V, and Pleasure P. Essentially, this was the undercard of the Omarion versus Mario main event. And it was quite a spectacle to be sure. And out of those four artists, I think Bobby V clearly has the strongest material. But anyway, while the pre-show came across more like a sideshow, I actually think that the undercard concept should be further developed and used more in Verzuz battles. Undercards are a staple of boxing. Sometimes, in fact, quite often, the undercard matches are more entertaining than the main event. Verzuz should add 1 to 2 undercards in each event. But here's the thing. The undercard matchups must be paired well. And each artist competing in an undercard should only do a 5-song medley, max. Most concerts have opening acts who might give the audience a solid 4 to 5 song set list. Verzuz can match up undercards as if they were 2 opening acts competing for the audience attention in a major R&B or hip-hop nationwide tour. Basically, the undercard would be a showcase for solid artists who can give you 5 consecutive bangers. The DJ warming up the crowd before the start of a Verzuz show is great, but I would shorten that and bring out 1 to 2 undercards for every Verzuz event. The intermission is when I would really let the DJ do his or her thing. Okay, number 3. Produce more tribute Verzuz battles showcasing the music of our legends who have passed on. So there are many Verzuz battles that would never happen in the way that we would have loved to see it go down because one or both of the artists are no longer with us. But their music will be with us forever. So I think Verzuz should find a way to pay tribute to these artists by matching them up in celebratory special event tributes. Imagine the sky high level of interest in a Michael Jackson versus Prince battle, for example, or a Biggie versus Pac battle. So, how can this be done? Well, there are several options. One way to do it is to recruit two artists of comparable talent to perform the songs of each legendary artist in the Verzuz format. For example, what if Verzuz put together a Marvin Gaye versus Teddy Pendergrass tribute? After all, there was a bit of a rivalry between the two of them in the late 70s to early 80s. Raheem DeVaughn could sing Marvin's very best 10, and Jaheim could sing Teddy's 10 best songs. Now, I admit this particular matchup will work unusually well, I think, because Raheem DeVaughn and Jaheim are both strong vocalists, and Raheem sounds a lot like Marvin, while Jaheim's vocals remind folks of Teddy P. So, that's the kind of perfect pairing that might be tough to duplicate on most Verzuz tributes. But the point is, there's ways Verzuz can give our legends who have passed on a memorable bouquet of flowers. Number 4, Verzuz should continue to emphasize data when coming up with matchups. So the pairings in the Verzuz matchups have been pretty good so far. There have been some obvious home runs. Brandy versus Monica immediately comes to mind. But a few pairings have been shaky. It's a challenge coming up with perfect pairings. Plus, the artists have to agree to do the event at the end of the day. And I'm sure Verzuz uses information such as Billboard chart history, album sales, Spotify streaming data, fan feedback, as well as a variety of other research when coming up with their next showdown. Verzuz should continue to put together greater emphasis on data, information that covers the entire size and scope of an artist's career, so that they can put together the best possible matchup that would draw the biggest and most passionate audiences. Number 5, put together more Verzuz rematches, and even consider pairing up artists who have already appeared on Verzuz in new and improved matchups. So Verzuz blew up during the global pandemic, and some of the best matchups took place when everybody, including the artists themselves, were at home. So I think a few of these Verzuz battles in the early days should absolutely be rematches, complete with live audience, and all of the bells and whistles that other later matchups greatly benefited from. Imagine past Verzuz battles like Jill Scott versus Erykah Badu, Brandy versus Monica, or Teddy Riley versus Babyface being run back live on stage in front of an audience with strong undercards, just as Verzuz did with the co-founders of the brand, Swiss Beats versus Timbaland. So number 6, showcase more artist matchups who represent other genres under the soulful umbrella of black music. So Verzuz have done this already with some good reggae, dancehall, and gospel matchups, for example. Some have generated bigger numbers than hip-hop and R&B Verzuz events, like the matchup between Bounty Killer and Beanie Man, for example. So I think we should see more of these matchups in soulful genres such as reggae, dancehall, and gospel, but also jazz, funk, house, bounce, go-go, and so on. Take go-go music, for example. Let's say Verzuz puts on a Tank versus Genuine matchup, and it takes place in DC, where both artists are from. Under that scenario, it would definitely be appropriate, and I think mandatory, to have two go-go bands each do 15-minute sets of their very best music as the event's undercard. Of course, I'm being a bit biased because I'm from the DMV area, and I know that go-go will always be king in DC without a doubt, regardless of such cultural dynamics like gentrification. But the point is, this is something that can be done with other soulful genres as well, based on local flavor and other factors. By the way, because many other musicians that are considered jazz greats have passed on, jazz as a genre is well primed for the tribute versus suggestion that I detailed earlier. I mean, just imagine a John Coltrane versus Miles Davis versus. Okay, so number 7, go younger. Now, the next 3 suggestions, it may rub some fans the wrong way, but they're very large elephants in the versus space that can't be ignored. Sorry, baby boomers and Gen Xers, the generation that I'm proudly a part of, but it's unavoidable. Versus has to eventually get younger and younger. Millennials and Gen Z are here. They're large in numbers and strong when it comes to influence. And before you know it, the spotlight will soon be on Generation Alpha. Verzuz will have to put more younger and active artists on the stage like J. Cole and Drake. The passing of the torch, on Verzuz that is, will come much sooner than some older music fans may realize. The growth of the Verzuz audience is necessary. Audience interest, measured by ratings, views, will simply not be sustainable without going younger, maybe even much younger, such as putting Lil Uzi Vert up against Trippie Redd in an event that is sure to draw millions of emo rap fans. So how do I know this? Well, I don't. I had to get feedback from my teenage son and Wikipedia. But anyway, going younger would benefit the Verzuz brand greatly by having artists pair up in battles while they're in the peak of their careers. If music from the younger generation is not in your lane, then just skip that Verzuz event. I've definitely taken the off-ramp on a few Verzuz shows already. So yes, a Verzuz ballad with Drake matched up against someone like Future must happen. Okay, number 8. Verzuz should invite pop, rock, country, punk, metal, Latin, and other music genres to the party. So, this might be the most controversial suggestion, but I'm sorry, fellow soul music fans, it's going to happen much sooner than later. In fact, I predict we'll see these matchups within the next 2 years. But if it jumped off as soon as the 2022 holiday season, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. I'm calling this a suggestion, but it's more of a guarantee. We could see the Rolling Stones on a Verzuz stage with U2. Legendary superstars in their respective genres, just like Toby Keith and Kenny Chesney, will eventually grace the Verzuz stage. I knew this would be developing as soon as Triller purchased the Verzuz brand, and even long before that, when major music industry outlets like Billboard began covering the Verzuz events. Now, if I'm being totally objective, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. It's certainly not bad for business, ain't that right, Triller? Imagine Katy Perry versus Taylor Swift in a matchup, for example. The truth is, there are some great matchups in genres outside of soul music that I can clearly see performing very well on the Verzuz stage. Matchups that would do bigger numbers than your favorite Verzuz, just to be honest. For example, I don't know who you would put up against Madonna, but I would certainly watch a Verzuz with her on the stage, without question. So just as with the Go Younger suggestion, putting artists from big-time musical genres like pop and rock music is just inevitable. It's bound to happen whether hardcore fanatics of the culture, as we say, Like it or not, open your minds up to it because it's coming. Okay, so number 9, Verzuz must raise the bar and lower the temperature. First, raising the bar. It's critical for Verzuz to simply demand that the artists who agree to participate in the battles bring their A+ games. That goes for the artists featured in the undercards too, not just the main events. Now I know some of these artists, they haven't been on the stage in years, much respect to them, but some are obviously rusty. Some of the music, as well as the artists themselves, frankly, haven't aged all that well. Nevertheless, when they get the Verzuz call, they need to come correct and give the best show possible, as if they were still in their prime. And it's not the hardest thing to pull off by any means. Much of that execution is on Verzuz anyway. The overall budget has to be right to give these stars, our stars, the brightest shine. By the way, masterful organization and management, especially time management, is a high premium that Verzuz has to be willing to pay in order to put on unforgettable events that fans talk about long after the 24-hour entertainment news cycle. Now, here's part 2 of my number 9 idea. Lower the temperature. I loved the Source brand when I was growing up, all through my teens and once I became a young man. But we all know what happened to the Source Awards. We've seen this movie before. Verzuz has to be careful to avoid falling into the liability trap. Much of the allure of great food is the sizzle. But great chefs know when to turn down the temperature, or else that steak is going to get burnt. In future events, Verzuz must tone down the spectacle, such as the overly exaggerated beef factor. The brand doesn't want to lose credibility. Sure, it might be entertaining to many, amusing to others, and a guilty pleasure for quite a few, myself included. But in the long run, it's not good for the brand. It's not good for business. And trust me, Triller, as well as Swiss Beats and Timberland, are all about business. Yes, they want to push the culture forward, but they're just as focused on boosting the valuation. Not just how much Verzuz is worth in terms of cultural currency, but how much it's worth in terms of millions, even billions of dollars. If you muddy up the brand, you bring down its value and risk shutting down its existence altogether. The battles should be fierce, but still fun, still accessible. And I'm not talking about whether it's free in your Triller app. Music is definitely a competitive contact sport, no doubt. But Verzuz simply must ensure it puts the very best product on stage, free of debilitating drama. So, number 10, last but definitely not least, here's my must-have suggestion that will likely ruffle the biggest and flashiest feathers. Verzuz must lure the biggest superstars to the stage. Period. Putting more living legends on the Verzuz stage will have a very positive outcome on at least part of my last suggestion, because the performances of superstars always come with high expectations. The way I see it, Verzuz will not reach its full potential as an all-time great franchise until it consistently puts the biggest names on its stage in the kind of battles that will go down in the history books. Now, I know the dilemma that Verzuz has. I'm sure they've been trying to make these must-see events happen for a while. And I understand that some superstar battles may be coming soon and going through negotiations as we speak. But Verzuz has to deliver. I also understand the superstar's dilemma. He, she, or they, if it's a group, don't want to get exposed. They don't want to take an L because of what they think so-called losing in the eyes and ears of the fans would do to their legacy. But like GameStar famously told us, this is the moment of truth, baby. Shout out to DJ Premier and the late great Guru. And just to show my full objectivity on this issue, allow me to call out, with the utmost respect of course, my favorite rap artist Jay-Z and my favorite female soul singer, Mary J. Blige. So, Jay-Z's the GOAT, in my humble opinion, and I've stated this before. And people who know me are fully aware of my firm position in the GOAT debate. It will not change. Never, ever. And when Jay made the statement that no one can stand on the same stage with him and go hit for hit, you know what? I pretty much agree. But with that said, Jay, you have to get on that Verzuz stage. You gotta do it for the culture. And for the record, 99.9% of rap artists should definitely not make the mistake of getting on the same stage as you. But I know one artist who can certainly hold his own in a Verzuz with Jay-Z. Number 2 on my GOAT list, Nas. Now, to Mary J. You pretty much said that getting on stage to engage in a Verzuz battle against someone like Tony Braxton or anyone else doesn't benefit you. Maybe you're right, maybe not. But it would definitely benefit the culture. Truth be told, in terms of sheer size and scope of catalog, I can't think of anyone who can hang with the queen of hip-hop soul on a Verzuz stage. Anyone from her era, that is. But I know there's a few who could press Mary J for at least a few rounds. So, Jay-Z, the Verzuz stage is calling you. Mary J. Blige, the Verzuz stage is calling you. And if Jay-Z and Mary J. Blige can get that Verzuz call, that means so can Beyonce, so can Rihanna, so can Kanye West, Nas, Eminem, Lil Wayne, Usher, so can Chris Brown, Drake, J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, Nicki Minaj, Cardi B, Mariah Carey, Janet Jackson, Anita Baker, New Edition, the entire Wu-Tang Clan as a group. Rest in peace to ODB. And many, many, many others. So if you didn't hear your name in that roll call, you should still receive that Verzuz ring. All of the biggest names in the game, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way to the present, any solo artist, duo, group, or band can and should get that Verzuz call eventually. Now, they can accept the call, ignore it, or keep tapping the decline button. That's up to them. But when it comes to that Verzuz call, no artist of any era or genre for that matter is untouchable. No one is above or beyond reproach. So, those are my 10 suggestions to make Verzuz bigger and better. Which ones do you agree with or disagree with? Any ideas you have that I didn't mention? Share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you hit the like button, and if you like the content, please subscribe to the channel and share it with your peoples. Your support is always appreciated. Here at Soulful Charts, we got the receipts. Thanks for joining me again. Peace.